Welcome. Let's move on now and take a look at Chapter 2, International and Organizational Culture. First off, what is culture? Again, I'll read but very briefly. Culture is the sum of the beliefs, rituals, rules, customs, artifacts, and institutions that characterize a population. In a national culture, it would be those things that characterize that nation. Let me take a look at just real simply of what that means. There was work done by one of the prime movers of psychology, taking a look at national culture. Culture runs deep. You don't see it. You don't see it. You have to really watch for it. But if you watch for it, you can see that it's real. What was found out was taking a look at what's important in different cultures. Let's take Japan. There's no mistaking why Japan chose the motto for its Lexus. And when Lexus came out, it was billed as the competitor to the best of BMW and Cadillac. When Lexus was introduced, the motto of Lexus was the relentless pursuit of perfection. Why do they choose that? The reason is, in Japanese culture, perfection is valued as something very important. It's something that you never get to. That would be nirvana. That would be a nirvana. But you get closer and closer, and as they get closer to perfection, it really motivates Japanese people. Would that same model work for an American car manufacturer, let's say General Motors or Ford? The relentless pursuit of perfection. Not a chance. Because Americans have a different cultural archetype. We see the attainment of perfection as there's no place left to go. Sounds like the words from a Janis Joplin song. No place left to go. I've gotten there. I've reached perfection. And perfection we equate with death. So perfection really doesn't turn Americans on. It's very unlikely that if you had a friend who worked in the automotive industry and they had moved their quality up from 99.41 to 99.45, that person would come home from work, call you up and say, guess what, we're at 99.5. We don't value that. Our American archetype is, if it works, it works. Let's move on and do something else. So culture, nations have cultures. Some nations are defined by birthright. If you're Japanese, it means that you're from the population that lived in Japan. You're born Japanese. America is different. We're a heterogeneous society. You don't have to be born here. You can come here. We're defined not by where you're born, but by our creed. In other words, you're American if you buy into the values of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence. So there's a difference there between political cultures like ours and ones of national origin like Japan. There was famous work done on culture by a man by the name of Hofstede. That's Hofstede. He's in your book. I don't know if he had a first name. I've never seen it. I think his first name was Richard, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he defined 4 value dimensions of culture, showing differences between different nations. And the 4 are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, and masculinity. I'll talk more about the masculinity later. Let's take power distance. Some countries are really big on power distance. I remember when I was introducing quality management for AT&T into our French offices, and I was in Paris working with a French work group, and I was telling them that that the manager, the leader's job is to let workers participate in decision making. And as I said that, I knew it wasn't going to fly in France. Because in France, that boss says, no, no, no. I'm here because I worked hard. I'm not sharing power. There's that power distance. So we said the words, but I knew it wasn't going to be the way we envisioned it. That's not the way France works. So power distance. Some countries have a big power distance like France. Some countries like the US, Canada, Norway, very low power distance. Second one is uncertainty avoidance. Some countries really, really don't want any surprises, don't want to take any risks. Some countries are much more comfortable with that. Hong Kong is an example. We'll take a risk. If we lose, we'll try something else. So uncertainty avoidance. Individualism. The US, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, most of the Western European nations of the North, Canada, are big on individualism. I can do it. A lot of cultures aren't. Japan, for instance. Japan is the collective. People are concerned about not me as an individual, but me as a member of the collective. There's a saying in Japan that a blade of grass shouldn't try to grow too high, because if it does, it gets cut down. You want to stay in the pack. So individualism. Then masculinity. I really don't like this term. There's nothing wrong with being masculine or feminine. It's just it doesn't belong here. Anyway, what Hofstadter meant by it is that being assertive, being domineering. Some countries are like that, other countries are not. So those are the four: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, masculinity. And then the Chinese added a fifth one, which makes sense. It fits in. Long-term orientation. Some countries have a long-term orientation. They're not concerned of whether we see the fruit this season or 5 seasons from now, as long as we see it. China would be an example of that. The US, much more short-term orientation. All too many companies go from quarter to quarter, being afraid to do things because they know at the end of the quarter they have to show their results to Wall Street, and investors might not like it. So long-term, short-term. We've looked at national culture. Then we go on to look at organizational culture. And organizations have culture. When you walk into a Starbucks or you walk into a McDonald's, you can see there's a culture there. Different kind of cultures. The Starbucks culture, the barista is very concerned that they give that person give you a great coffee experience. Okay? McDonald's, what's your order? And that's it. Fast at McDonald's, fast. You're probably not going to be poisoned by it. It's clean and it's relatively inexpensive. That's the culture. There's a guy called Edgar Schein, and he says that every culture has 3 different levels. There's the artifacts. What does that mean? It means all the underpinnings of that culture. You walk in some companies, and I've worked in companies like that, where there are corporate instructions, and the corporate instructions tell you just about how to do everything. Okay? Not much room for innovation there. They've got it all figured out. Dress codes. Dress codes say something about the artifacts of an organization. Office layout. You can walk into a company and pretty much tell just by looking. It can be empty. You can tell pretty much the management style that goes on. If you see corner offices and then a big work area, you've got a relatively top-down management. If instead you see an open area, very few corner offices, if any, and those are probably used for conference rooms, it's a very different organizational structure. We'll look at that later. Okay? So Shine talks first about the artifacts of culture. Then he talks about the values that a company might have. Let's take Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's gets criticized sometimes for not using organic milk, but Ben and Jerry's, and they continued the practice even when they were bought by Multilever. Ben and Jerry's pumps a lot of money back into the state of Vermont to help with different social causes. That's always been part of the Ben and Jerry culture. Another example would be Patagonia. Patagonia prides itself on being a green company trying to do no environment or very little environmental damage. Tries to make clothes that are functional and simple, and they have a strong commitment to the environment. When President Trump took office, one of the first things he did was to downsize by a lot 2 national monuments out west, one by 85%, one by 50%. That hadn't been done before. You know, we had operated on the basis that national parks, national monuments are sacred. Patagonia was not only irritated, but they backed it up. They went to court. And as of 2018, Patagonia is in court trying to stop the downsizing of those national monuments. So that's an example of companies' values. And then there's the basic assumptions that go underneath the values. Even in a green company, everyone knows that we want to be green, but we want to make a profit too. So that part might not be said, but it's implicit. So that's what Shine talked about when he talked about values. Companies can have either strong cultures or weak cultures. Southwest Airlines is an example of a strong culture. In Southwest, the employees are told to make your experience not only an efficient one, but a fun one. And Southwest often does things to just make your flight a fun experience. Sometimes even, I don't find it particularly great, but sometimes the flight attendants will sing during the flight. But they just try to really give you a pleasant experience. That's an example of a strong culture. There's weak cultures. Radio Shack, which went out of business, had a weak culture. You could walk in one Radio Shack and get good customer service, walk in another one, and it was like people were wondering, well, what are you here for? There was no strong unifying idea of what does it mean to be Radio Shack. So that's a weak culture. Performance is inconsistent. Customers lose interest. There can be a customer service culture. Nordstrom's is a perfect example of that. Nordstrom prides itself on customer service. Yes, they're pricey, but people who go there expect great customer service and they get it. There can be an ethical culture. Once again, I'll mention Patagonia, but I'll mention Johnson & Johnson too. And why I hate to mention Johnson & Johnson is that they did a great thing, but I'd like to have examples that don't go back to the 1980s. I'd like to have more examples of companies doing great things. But most of you probably know about what happened to Tylenol in the 1980s. In Chicago, a few people got sick, died after taking Tylenol, found out that the Tylenol had been poisoned. Never did find out who did it, whether it was confined to Chicago, whether it was something in the manufacturing process, whether someone went in the store and tampered with Tylenol in a few locations. But what Johnson & Johnson did was not to avoid responsibility. They didn't say, hey, it's not us, it must be something else. They didn't say someone tampered with our product. What Johnson & Johnson did is throughout the whole country, they recalled all of Tylenol. Now, Johnson & Johnson is based in New Jersey. I can picture a mountain of Tylenol capsules from all over the land going back into New Jersey. But they pulled the product. And what they came up with really quickly is the tamper-proof seal. All of you who might hate the tamper-proof seal on things, it dates back to that idiot in Chicago who killed people. That's why we got them. And it was the right thing to do. It fit in with Johnson & Johnson's values. Johnson & Johnson has a credo that I think mentioned in your book. At the very least, do no harm. Don't harm our customers. And so what they did was consistent with their values, but what it did also is it helped their product. Tylenol sprang right back again and is among the most trusted products in America. You can also have a culture of diversity. PepsiCo was a good example of this, where they embrace diversity. And diversity makes a lot of sense because most of the world doesn't look like us. We're 5% of the world population in a global economy. So diversity is important. Your book talks then about, can cultures change? And the answer is yes, but big caveat here. They change slowly. Cultures change slowly, and most people don't have the interest and the persistence to see it through. I've been in a company that tried to change its culture, and I knew that this is most likely not going to work. And it didn't. The CEO stuck with it for about 2 years. Then it became less and less of an issue. The culture reverted back the way it was. So if you want to try to change culture, you've got to be there for the long haul. You have to recognize first, why do we want to change it? Is it important? And if so, we've got a big job on our hands. If you want to change culture, and we'll talk more about this later, what can help is changing behavior. You can change behavior before you change values. And especially if people see the justification for that changed behavior. Case in point, Ford Motor Company was on the verge of going out of business in the 1980s. Japanese product, Japanese cars and trucks had eclipsed Ford. They came out with a product that was better, that worked better, more dependable. And Ford was looking down the chasm of going out of business. And they recognized it, justification. And then they changed behavior. And now Ford has a reputation for putting out a quality product. Okay, lastly, how do you socialize culture? You do it in a couple of ways. Let's begin with the new employee. And you have a choice of whether you do this or not. A good company, one that really wants to socialize an employee into their culture, has things like orientation, and not just a 1 hour orientation. I'm talking about orientation that might go on for several weeks, where you get to learn about the culture of the company, the history of the company, the heroes of the company. You know, there are heroes of companies. I recall one where the company's main computing equipment was going down, and the CEO and founder came in. There was a broken pipe in the room, and it was about to engulf the computer, and with an axe he broke a hole in the wall and took the water away, and the company was saved. Okay, heroes. You learn about the heroes, you learn about the values, you have an orientation. The military does this with basic training, with boot camp, where you go through a very rough experience with the idea that this is the way you get initiated. Going back into tribalism. You know, we've, as civilizations, we've only been around for 5,000 years or so. In tribalism, organizations, tribes did this. There was initiation to become an adult in the tribe. So this has a long, long background. And there's one of the ways you can do this is by mentoring. Mentoring can be a big, big help. Mentoring is where you take someone senior who kind of shows a new person the ropes and is a sounding board for them when they have problems. Doesn't have to be just one mentor. You can have several people who are mentoring. It doesn't have to be someone's, one person's responsibility. Your other choice is to not do anything. Have the person come into the organization, sink or swim. Might be effective, but you lose a lot of people that way. So those are the choices. Whether you come into an organization where it's embracing and accommodating for you, or whether you're just tossed in and hey, hope you make it. Lastly, the chapter ends with spirituality. You have to be careful about this. The difference between spirituality and religion. No company has any right to get its religion into your employment. So if they're talking about spirituality, that can be okay. Companies have had difficulties with this. I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but it's in your book, and it came very close to saying that you almost had to embrace the values of their particular religion to be part of that company. That's not good. That's not the American way. See you next time.